Welcome everyone to the VikingCloud and Worldline webinar. We just need a couple more seconds for everyone to be loaded in. We have quite a few attendants today. The webinar will start shortly. All right, it looks like we have people loaded in, so we will go ahead. Before we get started on our material, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items. Firstly, you will receive a recording of today's session, and this will be sent out by the Worldline team after the event. We will be running a live Q&A, so please ask questions throughout the session, and please submit your questions through the questions feature in your GoToWebinar control panel. On mobile, it's at the bottom of your screen, and on the web, I believe it's on the right-hand side. And please only submit questions through the questions tab. These are the only ones we will be able to answer during the Q&A. Lastly, at the end of the session, a survey will appear on screen, and please take time to complete this survey. It's very short, just 4 questions about the webinar, about the materials presented, and what you'd like to see in a future webinar. We would love to have your feedback on this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Colin, our host for the webinar today.
Thanks very much, Maria, and thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you find today to be educational and useful. As Maria said, my name's Colin Clark. I work with the Worldline Merchant Services team on the compliance side. Until recently, I spent the last 15 years as a QSA covering most of the certifications. And my role here as part of Worldline, the largest acquirer and processor in Europe, is to help give you some information about version 4. And to help with that, I'm delighted to say that I've got Natasja Bolton from VikingCloud, our PCI expert. VikingCloud, as you probably know, are one of the world's largest QSA companies. They're headquartered in Dublin, and they have clients in 60 countries worldwide. Worldline operate in 170 countries worldwide, so we have a fairly good crossover. Like myself, Natasja's worked in information security for getting on for 20 years. She's been a QSA in good standing for quite some time, and she's a client engagement manager providing advice and support to VikingCloud clients all over the world. Natasja's going to go through with you some of her insights into the changes in PCI DSS version 4 and how those changes may impact on your business. Obviously, every company is different, every implementation is different, but the aim of this is to give you a broad level insight to understand where you should be looking now. If you need any more QSA services or any support, obviously you can go to any QSA, but the contact details for VikingCloud are on the QSA Council website. Please feel free to reach out to them. So the aim of today is to leave you with an understanding of some of the major requirement changes and some of the reporting changes within version 4 and how they might affect you and what they might mean for your compliance. We can by no means go through all of them. Please reach out to us afterwards if you need any more information, and there is the option for you to ask questions in the chat. We have had some questions prior to the webinar, and we'll try to cover those as well. I hope you find today useful. If you do have any ideas or suggestions about other events that you'd like us to hold, other topics, please reach out. We need this to be informative for you guys. So, what we're going to cover today. So, we're going to give you an overview of what's changed in version 4 and have a look at the timelines, because some of these requirements you need to have implemented in advance in order for you to be assessed when you go against the new standard. So we'll run through the timelines and the time frames for version 4, and we'll look at the frequency control activities. There's always been this question about how often you have to do things in PCI. The one I always loved was periodic. A period could be a full stop at the end of a sentence, it could be a school class, or it could be the Jurassic period that lasts for millions of years. The Council have now actively defined what periodic references mean, and Natasja will take you through those. And then we'll look at some of the high impact and the new and involving requirements in the standard, so that we can highlight for you some things that you may not have considered. And then we'll give you some key points to remember at the end of it. So, what has changed? All right, although there are many changes to the actual standard, PCI really stays the same. There are 12 sections of requirements that haven't been changed. There have been updates made to define what the principal requirements mean. So you've now got things like do not use vendor specified defaults is now apply secure configurations to all system components. The intent is still the same. We're still aiming to try and give you a framework under which you can be secure. I do recommend that you read version 4 from cover to cover, not for your enjoyment, but help you to understand how it has been changed, approved, and updated. And there are explanation notes in there which are very, very useful. So please don't just rely on the summary of changes document and the ROC template, because the ROC template doesn't give you all the information that the standard document does. There is a lot of extra guidance. Some of it uses text from previously existing FAQs and information supplements, scoping, for example, but it clarifies things like terminology. It gives you specific information about account data versus cardholder data versus sensitive authentication data. So there's a lot of extra information in the requirements now. There's also a lot of detail that's given to the QSA for sampling, etc. And it actually says information there that you should be aware of, because it's what, if you use a QSA, you're going to be asked to do. And if you're doing it yourself as an ISA, you're going to need to yourselves. They have tried to tidy up the standard a bit, so they moved redundancy. They've tried to ensure consistency across the requirements. They're now consistent, so there's a new requirement for documentation which sits in the same slot in every one of the 12 the sections it applies to out of the 12 sections. They've merged some requirements, they've split some level requirements out, but it is a lot more organized, it's a lot clearer, it's a lot more hierarchical. There are new requirements in version 4, and the majority of these are applicable to all entities. There are a few that apply only to service providers, but I will note that some of those are duplicates of the ones that apply to everybody. It's just the service provider reporting is slightly different. And there are evolving requirements. That's requirements that have always been there that have been tidied up or improved or clarified. Those around data retention and disposal policies. And there are new elements to expand the scope in storage and retention to cover sensitive authentication data as well. And the only significant change in Appendix A is A1, which was called Shared Hosting Provider Appendix. It's now called Multi-Tenant Service Providers. It's the same kind of thing. And as this webinar is targeted at merchants and some of our internal colleagues, there aren't going to be many service providers, so we're not going to focus on those. There's a glossary included in there, which is extremely useful. So if you ever got doubt about a term that's used either internally or by your QSA, please go and have a look at the glossary in the standard. And there's been some changes, more importantly, and the thing that will affect a lot of people here is the self-assessment questionnaires that we'll refer to as SAQs, because in PCI we love our acronyms. They've been updated to reflect the version 4 requirement changes. They've tidied up the attestations of compliance. Most of it is around clarity and to help you to complete the document easily. They're actually more consistent with the AOC that went with the ROCs as well. There is a situation where you can have full or partial assessments now. As an acquirer, if you are having us providing or acquiring services, you are required to be compliant for the entire service that we provide you. So you could demonstrate compliance with 3 separate partial assessments, but they would have to equate to the whole of the business. So a partial assessment is where only a subset of requirements have been assessed. Some have been marked as not tested, some have been tested. That is probably only going to be useful to entities where they have different subsets of environments. Please talk to us before you go ahead with any partial assessments, because technically under version 3 a partial assessment was non-compliant. It is possible that an aggregate of partial assessments could make you compliant, in our opinion. In the report on compliance, there's a significant change. There's a lot more upfront detail. It actually is designed to ensure that the environment is accurately documented, and the reporting itself, there is quite a bit of change for the defined approach, and we'll explain the difference between the defined approach and the new approach later on. The great thing is that it is actually easy to read a ROC. However, for the audiences on here, you're not going to be reading many other people's ROCs, and if you're in the market for having to have a ROC done, you're probably going to have a QSA write it for you. What we have had is feedback from our QSAs and from VikingCloud especially, is that it is taking longer to write reports on compliance simply because of the level of detail that's got to be completed. So please understand that if you're having a QSA do your version 4 assessment for you for the first time, you may want to allow a little bit of extra lead time. If an ISA is doing it, you definitely want to give yourself some extra lead time. And the last point in the big things that have changed is this customized approach, an alternative way of assessing compliance. Please be aware that there is a difference between a customized approach and a compensating control. We will go into that later on. It is an alternative way of assessing it where you can meet the spirit of the requirement, but you cannot meet the actual wording of it. Whereas a compensating control is you cannot meet the requirement and you have to do something additional to make up for that. The only thing I would say, and I'm sure that Natasja will agree with me, is that the customized approach needs a really strong risk management team, needs a really strong security control framework, and needs extremely strong testing, guys. Okay, with that, it's time to hand over to Natasja. Natasja, please.
Brilliant. Thank you, Colin. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the timelines for the new standard. And at the moment, we're in the period where we actually have 2 active versions of the PCI DSS, the version 3.2.1 that we're all familiar with, and the new version 4. And at this point, and for those listening to the recording, we're at the end of June 2023. We're 15 months into that 2-year transition period between the 2 versions of the standard. And that transition period ends on the 31st of March 2024, so next year, when version 3.2.1 will be retired. Now, we, VikingCloud, have been monitoring merchant transition since June last year when we first started talking to merchants about version 4. And all through last year, the vast majority were still planning to assess against version 3.2.1 for their next assessment. Even as recently as March earlier this year, a good 45% of merchants that we asked were sticking with version 3.2.1 for their assessment. We found that there are very few early adopters of version 4. Now, be aware that even though we've got these 2 active versions that can be used for assessments, that doesn't mean you can take any kind of mix and match approach to either the requirements or to the assessment. So you can't follow the new version of a requirement because you prefer it or it's easier, or as Colin mentioned, use the customized approach while then completing the rest of your assessment against version 3.2.1 or vice versa. Now, the timeline here also shows you the date from which the majority of those new version 4 requirements become effective. All but 13, I think it is, of the 64 new requirements that are introduced with version 4 are future dated. They're shown in the standard as best practices, and you have a further 12 months after the retirement of version 3.2.1 to implement those new requirements, which means you need to have them in place by the 31st of March 2025 when they come into full effect. Now, Colin mentioned this already, the timeframes in PCI DSS, they've always been a little bit fuzzy, but they're now clearly defined and set out in the standard. So shouldn't really come as a surprise that when they say daily, that means every day, not just working days, and that does include Christmas Day, or that weekly equals performing the task once every 7 days. One of the most important definitions that they've clarified as it relates to internal and external vulnerability scanning is for quarterly activities. That's controls that have to be performed at least once every 3 months. By that, the standard means that you're performing the task on the same day of each 3rd month, or depending on the length of that month, every 90 to 92 days. Periodically is another big change that Colin spoke about earlier. That's where the time frame for the activity has to be set by you. So that's you, the assessed entity, based on your completion of a targeted risk analysis. So each of the requirements that provides flexibility for how frequently it's performed, it now must be supported by a targeted risk analysis to ensure that the frequency you're performing the task is appropriate, given the likelihood of the threat that the control itself is designed to address. Now, there are 9 new future dated requirements that require completion of a targeted risk analysis to determine and justify how frequently the activity is being performed. So that includes tasks like your periodic evaluations of the system components you've identified as not at risk for malware, or the frequency of your inspections of your point of sale card readers for tampering and substitution. There's a new other version 4 requirements, for example, would be the periodic review of application and system accounts. Need to be supported by a targeted risk analysis. I need to revisit that targeted risk analysis at least once every 12 months. Other timelines here that are worth, or timeframes rather, that are worth looking at are immediately. So that would mean in or near real time, and promptly, which is defined as soon as reasonably possible. And that's referenced in a number of requirements in their testing procedures. So for example, there's a new future dated requirement 10.7.2, where you need to promptly detect, be alerted to, and address failures of critical security control systems. Another thing that's been fully defined, and actually its definition has been expanded in version 4, is what they mean by a significant change in an entity's environment that should then trigger the performance of certain requirements. Also, therefore, worth looking at. Now, Colin mentioned the customized approach, and essentially the PCI Council recognised early on in the development of version 4 that organisations are managing and monitoring and securing their environments using a vast range of methods and technologies, not all of which are suited to the fulfilment of PCI requirements exactly as they're stated in the standard. So to address this, version 4 offers you 2 approaches for implementing and validating requirements. There's the defined approach, the method you're all familiar with, and then you customized approach. So the defined approach is where you implement the requirements as they're stated in the standard. If you do have a legitimate technical or business constraint, you can still consider implementing an alternative or compensating control. And then your assessor would follow the already defined testing procedures for the requirement to determine whether your control is in place. Now, with the customized approach, you, the assessed entity, can choose to implement your own controls to meet the defined customized approach objective for the PCI DSS requirement. There is no need or expectation for you to be subject to any kind of constraint to justify your use of the customized approach. You can design and implement security controls to meet the stated objective in a manner that's entirely unique to your business. But you must complete documentation for your assessor to review, which means that firstly, you need to document and maintain evidence about each customized control you've implemented, including all of the information that's specified in what they call the controls matrix template, which is in Appendix E1 of the standard. You also need to perform and document a targeted risk analysis for each customized control you've implemented using the targeted risk analysis template, which is Appendix E2 in the standard. Then you perform testing of each of your customized controls to prove its effectiveness. And you have to document all the testing you've performed and the results of that testing in your controls matrix, providing all of your completed documentation then to your assessor. Your assessor then has to review all of that documentation because firstly, they need to agree that you're meeting all of the customized approach documentation and evidence requirements. And then from your documentation, then they have to derive specific testing procedures that they'll use to validate that your implemented customized controls meet the customized approach objective. A lot of documentation, but the use of customized approach is highly flexible because you don't need to follow one approach or the other for your entire assessment. You could choose to use the customized approach only for selected requirements, or you could even use the customized approach for different implementations of the same requirement. And as it says on screen there, not all requirements can be met using the customized approach. Now I'm going to bring back Colin here just to talk about the use of the customized approach. Colin. Oh, you're on mute, Colin. Ah, there you are.
Sorry, I dropped out there for some reason. I'm not sure what happened.
We can hear you now.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for going through that, Natasja. So, very important note there. The customized approach requires specific testing procedures to be written, guys. So, Worldline's position is that a customized approach would only be acceptable or where the assessment is performed by a QSA, because only a QSA would have the training and ability in order to provide robust testing procedures. However, the good thing is that customized approach does offer flexibility. If you've got an innovative existing controls that will meet a PCI requirement, you can use those controls and pass PCI, but it requires considerable planning, it requires considerable testing, and it's got to be fully documented, as Natasja said. You need to know well in advance of the assessment you're going to use it. So it's not a situation where the assessor comes in, looks at what you're doing and says that doesn't pass the standard approach. You can't then suddenly decide, well, I'm going to use a customized approach instead. It is not a last minute thing. So if you are going to be using the customized approach, you need to think seriously about it, about whether it is a benefit to you in your assessment, and then to go through and do the documentation in advance. You probably need to work with your assessor in order to validate that your approach to a customized approach will be acceptable. What you do not want to do is to come up with a customized approach, fill out all the paperwork, have an assessor come in and either tell you straight away it doesn't work, or to develop a testing procedure that fails it. You've also got to make sure that the assessor fully understands what you're doing and that you understand the testing that he's asking you to do. Because what we're talking about here is saying we need to do something and we did something to do it. So you need to make sure that communication, an adversarial relationship with your QSA over this will not work. So as it says on the slide here, be selective. Use it where it will be a benefit to both sides. And we're getting feedback from VikingCloud, who've had feedback from their clients, and I've talked to fellow ex-QSAs who've also said that initially the use may be quite limited. However, there are opportunities when you look at things like zero trust networks, when you look at containerization, where a customized approach may be the way, as I said earlier, to use innovative technology and approaches to, in a secure manner, that will meet the PCI requirements. Be aware, even if you use a QSA to do your assessment, the rules from the PCI Council, who define the standards, are that the QSA who performs the assessment cannot play a role in the development of any customized controls. Basically, you can't audit your own work. You can use the same QSA company. So, for example, you could call Natasja in. You could have her help you devise some customized approaches. She could work with you to come up with testing procedures and validation procedures to make sure that it does meet what the standard says. And then when you have your assessment done, a different VikingCloud QSA would come in, and because the work has been prepared by a QSA, they will understand what they're doing, but it will be an independent verification of it. So it's got to be either an ISA or a QSA that does customized approach. At Worldline, we believe that the only people who have the training to devise the robust testing for customized approach would be a QSA. So please be aware. If you do have a strong ISA population and you are one of our merchants and you feel that you've got justification, please get in touch with us. We'll talk to you about it. So that explains who can use it. And let's go back to Natasja and talk about the new and evolving requirements.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Colin. Yeah, one last piece just in terms of the defined approach was to do with the compensating control. I think you touched on this earlier. Where we just wanted to clarify for everybody the use of the compensating controls and how that relates to the customized approach. So as we know, if you can't meet a defined approach requirement due to a legitimate documented constraint, then you can develop a compensating control to address the risk of not being able to implement the control as is stated. So you're achieving the objective through other means. So for example, I'm going to use the same example throughout this. If you're using or you have a legacy system that can't meet the defined approach for using unique user IDs, which is now requirement 8.2.1, and there's a legitimate constraint, then you can use a compensating control to achieve the objective of that requirement, which is all actions by all users are attributable even to an individual. You can't use compensating controls with a customized approach, and you shouldn't need to, because you're the one designing and developing your own unique solution implementation to fulfill the requirement's customized approach objective. So there shouldn't be any constraint hindering your ability to do that. So using the same example, if you're not assigning unique user IDs because you've got an innovative alternative solution to uniquely identify user access and user activities, so maybe involving biometrics and behavioral analysis to allow you to track individuals, that's when you could consider the customized approach. There's no constraint. Rather, your implementation just simply cannot meet the defined approach as it's written, and actually might be more secure than the defined approach as it's defined it achieves. So in that case, you'd work through the analysis and the testing, produce all the required documentation, demonstrating that the customized approach objective is met. So it's as Colin said, it allows you to recognize your innovative security investments to the benefit of your assessment. And you can use both the defined approach and the customized approach for the same requirement. So we look again at the unique user ID example. You could follow the defined approach to meet that requirement for certain system components in your environment, and potentially use a compensating control for a legacy system that can't support unique user IDs, is constrained, and also follow the customized approach to meet the same requirement for those new systems that support your alternative means of uniquely identifying your users and their activities. So lots of flexibility with the customized approach and the defined approach in combination.
Natasja, I think that the easiest way for people to remember it is going to be that a compensating control is when you have to do something extra because you cannot do what the standard requires. A customized approach is when you do something so different the standard can't even understand it.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about it actually is we've seen with version 3.2.1, because that's been around for such a long time, that it can't cope with all these new technologies. You mentioned containerization, etc. That the customized approach should mean that version 4 lasts longer, if you like, because it doesn't have to be updated for new technology. You can use the customized approach as technology changes. It doesn't need to keep up to address the intent and the objectives of a requirement. Okay, so hang on, I've gone too far there. Where were we? We were here. Right, so before we go on to the new and evolving requirements, the other thing to talk about is the self-assessment questionnaires, the other option for assessing your compliance. And as with version 3.2.1, there's a set of SAQs for version 4. And the main thing to note about them is there aren't any new SAQ types. They're the same SAQ types as you're familiar with. There have been some amendments and clarifications to each SAQ's eligibility criteria, some of which you probably see in what's on the screen there, but essentially they're the same SAQs. So if you're eligible for a particular SAQ at the moment, that eligibility is unlikely to change as you move to version 4. Now, only the 2 versions of the SAQ-D, so the one for merchant and the one for service providers, includes all of the PCI DSS requirements. So if you're self-assessing your PCI DSS compliance using one of those smaller SAQ types, it's very likely that many of the new PCI requirements introduced with version 4 won't impact on you. And that will be true even if actually what you're doing is using SAQ eligibility to determine applicable requirements, but you're doing a QSA-led assessment. Now, as you can see from the arrows there, all of the version 4 SAQs include a different set of requirements. So the SAQs A-EP, the e-commerce requirements, SAQs, sorry, the SAQ C and D, they have more requirements. And the SAQs B, B-IP, C-VT, and P2PE, they actually have fewer requirements. So some things have been removed. So for example, in the SAQs B and BIP, which are the standalone terminal SAQs, there's no requirement for questions in there anymore. And in the SAQ CVT, which is the virtual terminal SAQ, requirement 11 questions on segmentation penetration testing. They're not there anymore either. Now, the SAQs A-EP and C, they've actually lost quite a few questions due to the consolidation of requirements, but they are actually, as you can see, the SAQs most greatly impacted by version 4. The SAQ AEP, that's one of the ecom SAQs, that's got 32 new or additional requirements to be met. And by additional, what I mean is it's included an existing requirement, but it's new to the SAQ type. The majority of those 32 new requirements, they're in requirement 6, which is the one about developing, maintaining secure systems and software, and in requirement 8, which is the one for identify users and authenticate access to system components. SAQ-C, the point of sale system or payment application connected to the internet SAQ, that's got 40 new additional requirements. Again, mainly in requirement 8, but also in requirement 10, which is the log and monitor all access to system components and cardholder data section. Now, one change that appears in all of the smaller SAQs that I think is going to really help merchants understand context and applicability of the requirements in the SAQ is the inclusion of completion guidance and notes, previously only in the SAQ P2PE. Now, the guidance I think is particularly helpful in the SAQ-A and the SAQ-AEP, as it helps to explain how requirements apply, don't apply, to merchant e-commerce websites. And as with the version 4 ROC, as Colin said, there's more upfront detail needing to be included in the version 4 SAQs and their attestations of compliance. So previously, you were asked to list your payment applications, and in the SAQ P2PE to reference your P2PE solution. But now the SAQs ask you to list all in-use PCI Council validated products and solutions. So not just your payment applications, but also all of your approved PTS devices. So that'd be your hardware terminals and your card readers, any validated software, any software-based pen entry on COT solutions, PCI listed 3D secure SDKs, any approved listed solution. And lastly, the customized approach that we talked about, it's not supported in the SAQs. So therefore the SAQs don't include the customized approach objectives or any appendix for documentation of the customized approach. As Colin said, to use the customized approach, you'll need a ROC. Okay, now in this section, we've picked out some of the new and evolving requirements introduced with version 4 that we think are going to have a higher impact, likely to take significant time and potentially budget as well to implement. So we'll just walk through those. Now, is the first one, and it's applicable if you have remote personnel with access to PAN, because you must now have technical controls in place to prohibit or prevent the copying of PAN, to the full card numbers, to the remote user's local disk or local media. Now, the world's moved and businesses moved to having many more employees working remotely. The attack surface has increased. And similarly, we've got a shift from primarily on-premise physical infrastructure to cloud computing and all of the different flavors of as a cloud or as a service cloud categories. So there are many more remote access methods, many more remote access technologies in play, with the potential to grant remote users access to PAN in the CDE. So this requirement you're looking at here is one of version 4's new future dated controls that's intended to address and mitigate the threats associated with these behavioral and technology shifts since the 2018 release of version 3.2.1. Now, previously, this was a control that was enforced only through policy. You had to have remote access usage policies prohibiting the local copying and moving of card data by remote users. Now, you need to implement a means of technically enforcing this prohibition. Now, most of the remote access solutions in play allow the remote user to copy and paste files and folders from the client system or application to their remote desktop or storage devices by default. And what we've been seeing in terms of technical control enforcement is the use of the available policy and configuration options in solutions like VDI or Citrix or remote desktop RDP, etc., to actually disable local file transfer and copying. Now, clearly, if you don't have any personnel with remote access to full PAN, then this requirement's not going to apply to you. And I think for most merchants, the likelihood of remote users having access to full card data is much lower than it used to be. While you may have remote users or home workers taking customer card payments over the phone, typically that's going to be acceptance and processing of one card number at a time, where they don't have any ability to view or access the full PAN. But I think, and potentially many of you on the call, if you're a large enterprise merchant, or perhaps you're in the travel and hospitality sector, so maybe a hotel, you may well have stored electronic card data that could be accessible to remote personnel. So for you, implementing technical enforcement, banning and prohibiting copying or relocating PAN, that might be quite painful. And I think perhaps that this control, rather than resulting in implementation of technical controls to prevent that copying of PAN, it might actually drive more merchants towards the use of tokenization rather than storing PAN itself. That, however, won't work for everybody. So I can see this control requirement having a high impact, particularly, for example, on third-party service providers and payment processors, but there's not much else they can do.
Natasja, just on that point, I think you're right about the tokenization, and Worldline offer tokenization services. One thing people need to be very aware of is that where you use just a straight VPN access, to start with, that could be risky anyhow, because a lot of people configure their VPNs incorrectly. So they use split tunneling so you can view the internet and the CDE. But secondly, it's very hard to enforce this prohibition using VPN. So if anybody on this call know that their staff have remote access to the CDE and can call up and view PAN, I suggest strongly that you go and speak to your technical team now, present them this requirement 3.4.2 and ask them how they're going to comply with it. Thank you, Natasja.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Colin. Okay, the next one then is to do with one of my hashes of the PAN used as a means to render the stored PAN unreadable. So the 3.5.1 is the rendering stored PAN unreadable. This is an extension to that 3.5.1.1, where one-way hashing of a PAN is something that's commonly used to provide an identifier for customer tracking or correlation, where you never need to recover the original PAN from the hash, but you need to uniquely track or confirm the card holder. My favorite example for this is where you're booking a place in the airport long stay car park. I insert my card in the car park barrier to gain access, and that system's hashing my PAN to then match that hash with the card that I used for the booking. It'll give me access if the hash matches. But now, with this new requirement, that hash function needs to incorporate a randomly generated secret key. So with a keyed cryptographic hash of the PAN, the application generates a random string, a secret key, and combines it with the PAN before the hash gets generated. So when the hashing function incorporates a randomly generated secret key, it can actually be used to verify or validate the integrity of the hash value for a start. And with this change, it's also providing greater resistance to brute force attacks against the hash. Now, with a keyed cryptographic hash, the key, therefore, it's a secret, so it must be treated in the same way as any other cryptographic secret, so secured and managed in accordance with requirements 3.6 and 3.7 in order to protect the keys from disclosure and misuse. Now, there's guidance in the standard on suitable encrypted cryptographic hash algorithms, and also references the applicable NIST standards. And we think this one, as a new requirement, is going to be of high impact for organisations that currently store hashes of the PAN, because meeting this requirement is going to require almost certainly a technical change or a system upgrade, supported by the implementation of key management processes and procedures. And you need to bear in mind that it needs to be applied to your PAN data being hashed going forward, but also to the hashed PAN data that you already have stored historically. And you need to also consider, when you're analysing the impact and potential scope of this requirement for your business, that it applies to hashes of the PAN stored not only in primary storage, so in your databases or in flat file spreadsheets, for example, but also any non-primary storage, so in your data backups. Do you want to comment on this one as well, Colin? I think you had some thoughts on this, didn't you?
Yeah. So, guys, first of all, Natasja made the very strong point. It's the historic data that's going to give you a problem here. The problem is going to be compatibility, because you cannot reverse the hashes you already have, because a hash is a non-reversible process. So you now have a situation where you have a load of hashes, but now going forward, you have to create the hashes a different way. There is a quick and dirty solution that I thought I'd just throw in there, guys, which is quite simply, if you take all of the historic hashes and convert them into a cryptographic hash, that's your historic data done, going forward, you just need to make it a two-step process. So you hash it the way you used to, and then you cryptographically hash it. That means that going forward, you will get the same hash value as a card as you had historically. However, hashed card data is not in scope for PCI as long as you cannot correlate it with truncated or others to work out what the hash means. What this means is that you may find there is a significant amount of hashed data which is outside of the CDE. So what you need to be doing now is thinking about how you're going to convert the data in the CDE to meet the new requirement, how you're going to handle the new requirement going forward, but you also need to be looking at all the data flows, and you have data flow diagrams, you must have because you're PCI compliant. The data flows you've got where you know that you export hashed PAN from the CDE today, you need to track down where it ended up and convert that data. Natasja, anything to add to that?
No, I think that was a brilliant point. Actually, I hadn't even thought about that movement in terms of tracking it and finding it. Yeah, so that's a very good point. Thank you, Colin. Okay, let's go on to the next key one. I think is probably the best bet at the time. So another one related to the PAN, and this relates to securing the PAN where it's stored. Now, since the very early days of the standard, the use of disk encryption has been allowed. It's a means of rendering cardholder data unreadable, even when actually this type of control, disk encryption, just adds protection against physical attack vectors. We're encrypting the entire disk or the entire partition using the same key. Decryption is transparent. It's not highly effective, and we know that most merchants that VikingCloud works with today, they don't actually utilize disk encryption as the means to protect stored electronic PAN. So in that case, this new requirement isn't going to apply to them. However, again, we're seeing that this control may apply in certain merchant sectors, again, such as travel industry merchants who have those stores of electronic card data, or perhaps larger merchant entities with their own payment switch. So you've got your own settlement files locally, you're transmitting those to your processor or your acquirer. So for those organizations, and for you, if you are using disk or partition level encryption, we're thinking the impact of this new requirement is going to be quite high. Now it applies to disk level and partition level encryption rather than file or column or field level database encryption. It doesn't apply to database level encryption like TDE, so transparent data encryption, or to stream encryption. So that's where you've got an encryption appliance that's performing inline encryption of data. So there's a stream of data that's being ingested and it's encrypted before it's written to disk. Doesn't apply in that case. But if you are continuing to use disk or partition level encryption for non-removable, I can't even speak, non-removable electronic media, then you must also use one of the other available mechanisms to render the PAN unreadable. So that's per requirement 3.5.1, which is the one that talks about your options, one-way hashes, truncation, index tokens, etc. I suspect you've got a comment on this one as well, Colin. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. This is going to be a bad one. By the way, guys, please do not be fooled by your technical team. There is a technology called RAID, redundant array of inexpensive disks, where you can hot swap drives. Do not accept the argument from your people that because they're hot swappable hard drives that they're removable media. That is not, and it's clearly stated in the standard. As Natasja said, though, it is only where the disk structure is managing its own encryption. If you are encrypting a stream of data and then sending it to the disk to be stored, that is not disk encryption. If you use disk encryption at the moment, then you guys really need to be thinking about an alternative very quickly, guys.
Brilliant. Okay,
thanks,
let's
Natasja.
Move on to multi-factor authentication, which we should all be familiar with. It's been in the standard for a good while. So MFA, authentication based on the presentation of at least 2 different authentication factors. As I said, we should all be familiar with MFA. It's required for all remote network access from outside the corporate network environment and has been since the advent of PCI DSS. And even since version 3.2 of the standard, MFA has been required for all non-console admin access to the CDE. With version 4, it's introduced a new requirement, this 8.4.2, which says that MFA is required for all access into the CDE. Now, it's a future dated requirement, but once it's effective, the all access MFA requirement is going to replace the requirement for MFA for non-console admin access, and essentially everyone will need to be authenticated via multi-factor authentication for their access to CDE networks and systems, including for web-based access to an application or function. And as it says on screen here, MFA requirement also applies for all types of system components. So that includes your cloud and hosted systems, on-premise applications, network security devices, endpoints, etc. Now, I just wanted to illustrate where and when MFA is required now. So it's required for both types of access. So for the all access to the CDE, all access MFA requirement 8.4.2, and you need MFA for your remote access, that's now 8.4.3. You need to apply MFA, or rather applying MFA to one type of access, so to remote access, for example, doesn't replace the need to apply another instance of MFA to the other type of access, which means that depending on where your access to the CDE starts and ends, MFA might need to be used more than once, which is what this diagram is trying to illustrate. If you look at the remote user on the bottom left, that individual first connects to the entity's network via remote access, and then later initiates a connection into the CDE from within the network. The individual will need to authenticate using MFA twice, which is why we're thinking that the all access MFA requirement is a high impact change. It's extending your MFA deployment beyond just your remote users and your administrative users, therefore adding to the load and the complexity of the MFA solution that's in use. Okay, now this next one we're thinking is one of the changes that has the highest impact from an operational point of view, because internal vulnerability scanning now must be run as authenticated scans. So that provides greater insight into the vulnerability landscape, since an authenticated scan can detect vulnerabilities that an unauthenticated scan can't. So for example, where an application or service doesn't have any open TCP or UDP ports, it couldn't be reviewed by the vulnerability scanner. But an authenticated scan works by using account credentials, logging onto the system remotely, or perhaps by running an agent on the system, which means that using an authenticated scan method, the scanner has access to internal resources, such as registries and package versions, and is able to see the conditions of all applications and services on the system. So it can detect vulnerabilities of all types affecting installed software or applications and libraries, because it's not relying on open ports and network visibility. It's giving you more of an inside-out view of the system vulnerabilities. But what that also means is when you're moving from performing network-based vulnerability scans to authenticated vulnerability scans, you're highly likely to experience an increased level of detected vulnerabilities, and with that, an additional level of effort and time to remediate those vulnerabilities. Plus, you need to bear in mind that you're going to have to protect and control the privileged credentials that are being used for the authenticated vulnerability scanning, in line with the other PCI requirements in requirements 7 and 8, in particular the requirement for controlling and ensuring attributable use of group shared and generic accounts, which is why we're thinking authenticated vulnerability scanning is going to be a high impact requirement with a long implementation lead time, and so is an activity you should start looking into sooner rather than later. So perhaps running your authenticated scans in parallel with your current unauthenticated internal scans, and maintaining a separate track of remediation. You don't want your authenticated scan results to conflict with or present any risk to your ongoing PCI compliance, but you do want to start addressing any new vulnerabilities that are identified by authenticated scanning. Colin, you want to comment on this one before we move on to
Yeah, I think the point you made there was extremely important, Natasja, that because the fact the vulnerability scanner is going to need to log in using a system account on each of the boxes, the vulnerability scanner is going to be holding credentials for your CDE. That means that your vulnerability scanning engine is in scope. So please go and talk to your vulnerability scanning team about this, because if that box that has all the credentials is sat on another network and is not part of the CDE already, which is normal, you've just suddenly brought your network operations center or your security operations center into scope for PCI guys. So just be aware of that.
Okay.
Natasja, I'm conscious of the fact that we only have 10 minutes left and a lot to cover. So we're going to take a quick look at SAQA and the changes that have applied there. This is the one for e-commerce merchants that have outsourced all of their account data functions. It's a very popular one, and the plan now is that Natasja is going to run through quickly some of the impacts for you on SAQA. Back to you, Natasja.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, so we've got new and additional requirements in the SAQA version 4. These new technical requirements, they only apply if your website's using a URL redirect or using an iframe for integration with the payment service provider. And it's an SAQ that's evolved to address the risks to e-commerce websites. We've looked at, for example, web skimming and similar attacks. The council's taken that on board and they've implemented new requirements and additional requirements into the SAQA. So these 3 here are effective immediately. So as soon as you do a version 4 SAQA assessment, and they relate to website vulnerability management and its effectiveness. So you were already required to protect your e-commerce website by installing relevant patches, but now 6.3.1 is saying, well, you need a proactive approach to monitor for new security vulnerabilities and risk rank them, because a medium vendor vulnerability might actually be critical for your website. And then the headline change here that's immediate for the SAQA is the inclusion of external vulnerability scans, both approved scanning vendor, so ASV quarterly scans, and external vulnerability scans after a significant change, which will obviously help you understand whether your patch management in itself is effective. But the ASV scans will also help identify web application vulnerabilities, configuration issues, known vulnerabilities with common web scripts, for example. Now 11.3.2 has to be done by your ASV, but 11.3.2.1 doesn't need an ASV. It can be undertaken by internal qualified personnel. It has to be done after significant change affecting your e-com environment. And if you're an SAQA eligible merchant that wholly outsources your e-commerce website, these external vulnerability scanning requirements can be marked as not applicable. They're going to be covered for you by your third-party service provider who's managing and monitoring your website. But that is something to check when you review their AOC. Now, there are 2 significant future dated e-commerce impacting requirements. For you, if you're an SAQA eligible merchant, they only apply if your website's using an iframe, so the hosted payment page is embedded in your website. But they also apply to e-commerce merchants that use a direct API, so your website is presenting the payment page and receiving the card data back from the consumer. And they also apply to websites that create the payment page but don't receive the card data back. So perhaps you're using a direct post or the kind of method you see here, which is a JavaScript created form. These requirements are specifically intended to protect payment pages used by e-commerce merchants to address those web skimming types of attack, the kind of thing that you can see here where the attackers compromised the merchant, inserted their own JavaScript to skim card data. Now, requirement 6.4.3, it's a preventative control. It asks you to manage all of your payment page scripts by maintaining an inventory of those scripts running on your payment pages with written justification of why one is necessary or why they are necessary. And then you need to also implement a means of confirming that each script is authorized and its integrity assured. Now that needs to include, in terms of inventorying scripts and justifying them, all third, fourth, and nth party scripts, not just scripts loading from your own environment. And you need to note that to justify each script, it needs to be shown to be necessary for the functionality of the payment page to accept a payment transaction, not for any other purpose. So if you've got a payment page script that's for tracking sales conversion, highly unlikely that you'll be able to justify that as necessary for the payment transaction. Now, the standard includes examples in it of what's available to you to authorize and assure the integrity of your scripts, which includes things like content security policies, sub-resource integrity, which is SRI, and also there are proprietary script and tag management systems. This one we're thinking is a medium impact if it's applicable to your environment, as is the next one, which is more of a detective control, which is intended to tell you whether or not the web application in the browser is behaving only as intended, and then alert you if it isn't. So you need to deploy a mechanism that's capable of detecting unauthorized changes or any indicators of malicious activity on your website's payment pages, and then that mechanism needs to alert you, either once every 7 days or periodically as determined by another targeted risk analysis. Now, the only place to detect those changes or indicators of malicious activity is in the consumer browser, as the payment page is constructed and as the JavaScript being interpreted by the browser. And the intent is for you to utilize tools and techniques to be able to detect and alert for that unauthorized modification to HTTP headers or to the contents of the payment pages as they're received by the browser. But what it doesn't mean is installing software on your customer systems or their browsers. Now, there are mechanisms available to detect and report on those changes to the HTTP headers and the content of payment pages, including content security policies, external monitoring by systems that can request and analyze the received pages, so synthetic user monitoring, for example. And you can also use mechanisms such as tamper detection scripts, which can look for malicious script behavior. So again, potentially a medium impact for those of you that this applies to. Now, as we've touched on SAQA, I want to briefly show you some of the high impact.
This slide is quite self-explanatory, and we're supplying all of our merchants with a paper which will be issued on the compliance portal shortly. So I wonder, with this short time we have available, whether we should just allow everybody to read the slide at their own leisure and have a look at the white paper which is being issued on the portal. We'll let you know when it's out. And it does explain to you those significant requirements in the SAQAs, which ones they apply to, and it gives you an outline description of what the impact is. But Natasja, do you want to pick a couple of those out since we're down to our last 3 minutes?
Well, I think the major ones are the ones we've talked about, really, and certainly the three at the top there with asterisk are only relevant if you've got bespoke and custom software. So actually, they're not going to impact you if you're buying off the shelf software. So the ones we've talked about already, I think, are the major ones. Perhaps the 541 in terms of you'll need a mechanism for automated detection and protection against phishing attacks. So it's not related to card data, if you like, but it's a requirement saying you need to protect personnel against phishing, and not just security awareness training, but actually some kind of automated mechanism. That's quite a significant one. And perhaps 421 above that in relation to it's an existing requirement about protecting PAN during transmission over open public networks, but it's now got this additional element saying you need to be able to confirm that certificates are valid and aren't expired or revoked. Those are probably the two major ones, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And thank you for the clear explanation of the major ones. As a stress, that is not all of them.
No, exactly. And actually, as you mentioned, and we'll be showing a resources slide towards the end. There's an SAQs ebook that has a full table of everything that's changed in the SAQs that people can reference what's changed and what's new, so they can refer to that. It's an easy, I was going to say one-page guide, but
do you want to skip to the next slide?
Yes. So I just wanted to put up a sort of reminder of some of the key points. So yes, you can complete your last version 3.2.1 assessment right up to the retirement date at the end of March next year. So if your annual assessment isn't due until early in 2024, you can still complete your assessment against version 3.2.1 and give yourself another year before you need to validate against version 4. But you do need to bear in mind that 31st of March 2024 is a cutoff date. So you need to have completed your SAQ or your assessment, have your AOC signed, and that means leaving yourself enough time to address non-compliances, to get requirements reassessed, and get all your validation documents completed before that date. Now, as we've seen, the majority of the 64 new requirements are future dated. So what that means is when you're doing your first version 4 assessment, up until their effective date, you can mark those future dated requirements as not applicable, but they do need to be in place before the 31st of March. Once they become effective, that means you're expected to have them in place. Even if your assessment isn't due for several months after that, you still need to have them in place by their effective date. Other points to note here. So initial assessment of newly applicable requirements. So we talked about quarterly ASV scans being included in the SAQA. What that means is you need to have completed and have a passing scan within the most recent time frame, but you don't need to have done ASV scans for the previous year before your first initial version 4 assessment. We've covered off those two approaches to implementing and validating requirements. Hopefully you'll agree that the new customized approach, yes, you can choose to use it if you are implementing and achieving a requirement differently than is stated in the standard, but I think you'll see, or have seen as we've discussed today, that there is a need for considerable prior planning and preparation to be able to use that as an approach for your assessment. Yeah, so essentially from our point of view, we're saying, well, recommending stay on version 3.2 to 1 as long as possible, because it'll give you that time to plan and prepare for version 4. There's a lot of additional documentation required, whether it's in the ROC or documentation that you need to produce. For example, you actually do need more complete documentation that you would have done before to review and confirm that you validated your PCI DSS assessment scope. You might need to update policies and procedures because things have changed subtly. We looked at timeframes, for example. You might find that the frequency you're performing things has actually changed. So from our point of view, don't commit to version 4 until you really understand the effort that's going to be needed and that you're actually ready to achieve compliance against that standard. I think, Colin, I'll bring you back in at this point, see if there's anything else you want to cover. We're at time.
Skip to the next slide. So guys, just to help you, there are some resources here. Worldline have a useful information page. VikingCloud have some extremely valuable information. Use the resource hub from the PCI Council, read the standard. The summary of changes is useful, but that doesn't explain everything. The council have a habit of not understanding the difference between must and should. Should means you ought to do something, must means you have no choice. If you have any questions, unfortunately we've run out of time, we can't field any questions on this, but if you have any questions, please reach out to us. You have the invite address, or if you have a question about your own specific environment, please talk to your normal Worldline support contact in merchant services. If you need any QSA help, then please reach out to us and we'll put you in touch with VikingCloud, or you can go to the council website and you can have a look at the list of approved QSAs there, including in your native language and in your own region. So thank you very much. I think I'll hand back to Maria.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, so with this, thank you very much, our hosts, Colin and Natasja. This was a great presentation today. And to our audience, we hope you found this very useful. If I may ask, please stay online for a few more seconds because the survey will pop up automatically, and we'd be very grateful if you could answer those few questions. And as mentioned, you will receive the full presentation. It will be sent to you from the Worldline team. So with this, I thank you for your time and wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.